Hi, I'm Dr. Michael Miller, one of the pastors at Foundation Baptist Church, and we're delighted to have you tune in tonight for our Calgary Bible Institute. The course that we're offering this fall is Biblical Counseling. And if you're a believer, then I think you'll find something for you in this class. I would say that our first lecture is probably not geared to young children, probably for about ages 12 and up, it would be appropriate, but I just want to warn you about that because of the nature of what we'll be covering as we look at influential secular psychologists. Some of what they believed and practiced was disturbing, and I will not try and be graphic, but I do want to caution you that it may not be suitable for younger children. We'll get right to the million-dollar question, and we're going to be starting with the notes called The Need for Biblical Counseling. If you're not on our email list, drop me a message via email or on our Facebook page, and we'll be happy to get you on our notes list. But let's get right to the million-dollar question. Does the Bible speak to mental illness? Does the Bible speak to those who have been diagnosed with some sort of mental illness or disorder? Or to phrase it another way, does the Bible have answers to today's complex questions? Should we as Christians just defer to psychologists when a friend approaches us with some emotional issues? Does the church even have any business interfering in today's psychological disorders? In other words, we're asking, who is competent to counsel? Are Christians competent to counsel, or are only licensed professionals competent to counsel? Are mental disorders the arena of the psychologist, or does the Bible speak to such issues? And if the Bible does speak to it, does it have real-life answers? Most professionals today, including many Christians, would say, no, the Bible has little to say about mental illness. Leave that realm to the psychologists, the psychiatrists, the licensed therapists. Let them handle these issues. We're not competent to counsel. We're not qualified to speak on these issues. So maybe you're asking yourself the question, why should I take a class on biblical counseling? Whether you're just watching for personal enrichment or taking it for credit through our institute, why should you take a course on biblical counseling? In short, I believe we as Christians have been had. We have been deceived by secular psychology. I believe it's helpful for all Christians to get counseling training, to get equipping in this arena of counseling. And that's why I'm grateful to the Lord that you are putting forth the effort to watch this video tonight. There's several reasons that every Christian needs counseling training or equipping. First of all, every Christian does informal counseling. You counsel whether you realize it or not. It's not a matter of whether you counsel, it's whether your counsel is biblical and helpful or unbiblical and unhelpful or destructive. You're constantly sharing ideas with others, friends and family, and thus you're constantly shaping their view of God, their view of themselves, and their view of their circumstances. We're counseling all the time. It's not an issue of whether we counsel, it's whether our counsel is biblical. Second reason we need counseling equipping is that you have friends that are looking for answers to life's dilemma, and they need your counsel. They need wise counsel. They need marriage and family counseling. Those of you that are training for ministry, this will be the bulk of your counseling. I remember my dad telling me that as I was entering into the ministry, that marriage and family counseling would be the bulk of the counseling that I would do as a pastor, and he was absolutely right. Premarital counseling, career counseling, guidance counseling, decision-making counseling. You have kids that need to make decisions about what to major in, what careers to pursue, whom to marry. Financial counseling, friends asking for financial advice. crisis counseling, a friend that has a loved one die suddenly and tragically, relational counseling, helping people with friendships, and what I call Galatians 6:1 type counseling, where somebody has fallen, a fellow Christian has stumbled into sin and they're caught in it and they need you to help them to get out of that sin. Addictions, life-dominating sin habits such as sexual lust, panic attacks, anxiety disorders, fear, depression, marriage conflict, mental breakdowns, mental illness, rebellious children, uncontrolled tongues, unreconciled relationships, angry outbursts, eating disorders such as anorexia, bulimia, and gluttony. Fellow believers need Galatians 6:1 type counseling from you. There's another reason that it's helpful for believers to get training in this area of biblical counseling. Third reason is that the church has deferred to psychology. Psychology has encroached on ground that was once reserved for the church, the care of souls, and they've said, no, this is our domain and you are not qualified to speak to it. The Bible does not speak to these issues. That's what we've believed by and large, and so we have deferred to secular psychology. We've been reluctant to get involved in mental illness. We have been told that mental illness is a biological issue, not primarily a spiritual issue. We have been told that we as Christians don't have the answers. We have been told that we need extensive secular training, and we have by and large believed this as Christians. I remember the mother of a boy at the university where I was a residence hall supervisor when I was going through seminary. Her boy needed biblical counseling, and so we were going to assign him to our resident biblical counselor in our residence hall. And the mom was not excited about this at all, but the boy really needed it. He was very spiritually immature. And I remember what this mom told me as we were talking about her son meeting regularly the next semester with our resident biblical counselor in our residence hall. And she told me, she said, a counselor can really mess somebody up. and it's true. We weren't going to mess her boy up. He was already spiritually very weak and I obviously hadn't gotten the training in his home. But the point she made was valid. Counselors can really exacerbate the problem rather than helping. A fourth reason that we as believers need biblical counseling training is that secular psychology largely has an unbiblical worldview. The worldview of most secular psychological theories is antithetical to the biblical worldview. Secular psychology is almost exclusively man-centered. It's not biblical. That doesn't mean that all psychologists are bad or all therapists are not going to do you any good. But by and large, they have adopted a man-centered philosophy. Another reason that Christians need biblical counseling training is that psychology, secular psychology, has failed to provide substantive help to most people with mental illness. Even when secular psychology accurately diagnoses a problem and they can label it accurately, secular psychology has little to offer by the way of remedy. In other words, how are you going to fix this? How are you going to change? Not just with some external change, but deep-seated change that will last. They're offering Band-Aids when what people need is a heart transplant. And most of the remedies that it offers at best are simply just common sense advice that anybody could give. And at worst, godless, man-centered, humanistic counsel that is destructive to the client. But there's another reason, a sixth reason, that it's important that Christians have biblical counseling training. Because when you're struggling emotionally, perhaps with fear, anxiety, worry, depression, you need to know to whom you should turn. Should you go to psychologists for help? Do they have something that Christianity does not have? Do they have answers that the Bible does not have? Where should Christians turn when they believe they are mentally ill? Should they go to secular psychology or should they go to biblical counseling? I hope this class will answer that question for you. And the seventh reason that believers need biblical counseling training is that God wants you to have confidence in the sufficiency of Scripture. God wants you to have confidence in the sufficiency of Scripture so that you can use it in your life when you run into emotional and spiritual difficulties, but you can also help your friends and family who need your counsel. That's why biblical counseling is important. So let's move on to the second set of notes quickly, called Introduction to Secular Psychological Theories. I want to overview the basic secular psychological theories and the history of it, not to bore you with history, but to demonstrate to you that secular psychology does not have the answers to the deepest needs of our heart. So I'm painting a contrast here. Does secular psychology have the answer, or does biblical counseling have the answers to mental illness? Well, psychology, as we know it, got its start in Germany in the 1800s. A fellow named Wilhelm Wundt. He was the son of a Lutheran minister, and he opened the first psych lab in Germany in the year 1879. Wundt was a philosopher, he was a medical doctor, and he became a psychologist. In fact, he was the first person to refer to himself as a psychologist. He's known as the father of experimental psychology. So he was trying to approach it from a scientific perspective. He focused on scientific research and in fact was not counseling people at all. He's not what we would think of as a modern day psychologist or psychiatrist or therapist. He was doing purely scientific research. And there is a place for psychology that focuses on scientific research. But psychology did not stay there for long in just doing scientific research and experiments. It quickly moved into the arena that the church vacated, that is, the care of souls, dealing with people's minds, personalities, and souls. The history of psychology can basically be broken down into four major phases or time periods. The first is what we call psychoanalysis or first force psychology. The two biggest names to associate with psychoanalysis or first force psychology are Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. Freud, of course, is well known to this day. He had a lasting impact on secular psychological theory. He was an Austrian neurologist in the 1800s. He is known as the father of modern psychology. He referred to himself, his own words, he classified himself as a completely godless Jew and a hopeless pagan. Allegedly, Freud's father got pushed around by a Christian, and this Christian got his father's clothes muddy, and Freud vowed that he would get revenge on Christians, and boy did he ever. What did Freud believe? Well, Freud thought that morality was the outcome of the growth of society, which could only exist by adopting codes of conduct. He thought the Bible stories were fairy tales and that religion was invented to meet the needs of men. When you think of Freud, his basic foundational concept was that the human mind is both subconscious and conscious. That's the basic tenet of Freud's teaching. So when somebody says, I just had a Freudian slip, that means their subconscious was coming out inadvertently. Freud basically taught what we would call psychic determinism. In other words, that you are not responsible for what you do. You are not responsible for what you do. And Freud described the human personality with three components: the id, the superego, and the ego. The id basically are pleasurable drives, primitive drives, such as the desire for sex or aggression. The superego is a kind of conscience or morality, and that morality is instilled, Freud believed, by parents and the church. It's not within us naturally, but our standards come from outside of us. And Freud believed that individuals who had mental illness had a superego or a conscience of sorts that was too strict. And then the ego, the third component, is the conscious self, what we are aware of. It's the reality principle. And Freud taught that a battle takes place in our subconscious where the superego thwarts the expression of the id, thereby causing problems. So the ego was like a referee between your id and your superego. So basically, in Freudian therapy and psychoanalysis, as Freud viewed it, the counselor, the therapist, the psychologist, his job is to treat the patient by helping the patient get rid of false guilt and then helping them to adopt reasonable standards. In other words, Freud was basically teaching your parents, your church, your religion, your culture has instilled in you this strict conscience, and that's where the problems are coming from. Your conscience is too strict, and that's why you have mental illness. So essentially, in Freud's view, the psychotherapist is trying to weaken the counselee's conscience to tone it down so it doesn't convict him or her. So Freud taught that the human ego employs three subconscious defense mechanisms as the referee between its id and its superego. Repression, intentionally forgetting. Second, projection, projecting or basically attributing undesirable feelings or impulses onto another. Illustration that's commonly used is a man who's been immoral, projecting his immorality on his wife, so accusing his wife of being unfaithful to him when in fact he is the one that has been unfaithful. The third defense mechanism is regression, retreating to an earlier stage of personality development because of the stress involved in the current stage that you're at. Now here's where Freud got especially bizarre and frankly downright gross. Freud theorized that we as humans have libido, a kind of sexual energy, psychosexual energy flowing through us and at different stages in our life, moving to different parts of our body as we mature. Freud believed in 5 psychosexual stages of development. First, the oral stage, the mouth with the breastfeeding. Second, the anal stage from years 2 to 3, when kids are often going through potty training. He believed that the libido shifted to that region of the body. Third stage, the phallic stage, for kids ages 4 to 5 approximately. I'm going to try and be careful here, but it's disgusting what Freud thought. He believed that this libido, this psychosexual energy, was centered in the genitals of 4 and 5-year-old kids. And this is where the concept of the Oedipus complex in boys came from. Or basically, Freud taught that boys in their subconscious long to have sexual relations with their mom. So they hate their dads and try to overcome their dads, but when they realize they cannot triumph over their dad, they eventually begin imitating what their dad does. The Electra complex in the girls is basically the same thing, that the girls have a desire to have sexual relationships with their dad and initially view their mom as a threat to that. Disgusting for sure. Fourth psychosexual stage in Freud's theory is the latency stage from 6 to 12, where he believed this sexual energy went dormant, latent. And then fifth, the genital stage from puberty on, where the libido, Freud taught, was centered again in the genital region of the body. Again, I'm not trying to be graphic here, but I want you to understand what Freud taught. So in Freud's theory, fixation is when a person gets stuck in a stage of development and can't move beyond that. So he would teach that adults would be stuck in phases and not have moved up to the next psychosexual stage. So for instance, I've heard it illustrated that an alcoholic in Freud's view would be stuck in the oral stage, the first stage, and the alcohol would represent his mom. Bizarre for sure. So the goal of Freudian psychotherapy is for the client to gain insight into his subconscious, to become conscious of the subconscious. The illustration that's been used is the tip of the iceberg. The tip of the iceberg, that's the conscious, but most is below, the subconscious. That's how Freud viewed the human personality. So in order for the person, the client, to become aware of the subconscious, the psychotherapist would often encourage the client to talk to them like they are a key figure in their lives. So the psychotherapist who practices Freudian theory might encourage the client to view them, talk to them as if they were talking to their mom. In short, Freud allowed people to blame their problems on their past or on their subconscious, or parents or church that gave them this hypersensitive conscience. So in Freud's view, man is not responsible for his actions, plain and simple. So Freud is the most influential psychoanalyst and perhaps the third most influential psychologist of all time. Another well-known psychoanalyst is a fellow named Carl Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist who was a friend of Freud. They actually worked together, researching until Jung criticized Freud for his hypersexual view of children. And then a split occurred between Jung. Jung was more open to the spiritual as well. I won't spend any more time on Jung, but I've got some things in the notes about him if you want to become more acquainted with him. But he never ended up being nearly as influential as Freud did, though Jung was still a significant figure in psychoanalysis. So that's the first major phase of psychology, modern psychology. The second major phase is what we call behavior modification. Behavior modification, or it's also known as second force psychology. Not surprisingly, some psychologists were turned off by Freud's complete lack of scientific basis for the assertions that he was making. Freud was not doing the type of psychology that Wilhelm Wundt was doing. Freud was making all kinds of wild speculations that were completely untestable and unprovable. And so many psychologists revolted against this and founded a segment of psychology known as behavioristic therapy. You're probably familiar with one of these behavioristic therapists, the psychologist Ivan Pavlov. You've heard of Pavlov's dogs? Well, he was a psychologist. Another famous one was John Watson, who was an American psychologist. Behaviorists basically teach that the environment determines what we become. We are simply products of our environment, because in their view, we come into the world as blank slates, neither good nor bad in nature. I had someone tell this to me recently, that they believe that all human beings come into the world neither good nor bad, and what they choose determines what they can become. Well, that's not a biblical view of man and his nature, and we'll look at that next time. But to the behaviorist, all behavior is learned, perhaps imitating parents, culture, these sorts of things. So to change a person's behavior, to change a client's behavior, behavioristic psychotherapists use a system of reinforcements or rewards, we would say, and punishments. And perhaps the most famous behaviorist psychologist was a man named B.F. Skinner. B standing for Burris and F standing for Frederick. He was an American psychologist born in 1904. He taught at Harvard. And B.F. Skinner popularized behavior modification probably unlike anybody else has. He agreed that behavior is learned, yet he believed it was determined primarily by consequences. So he tried to use science to control human behavior. Skinner is famous for his experiments with pigeons and with rats, who the rats learn to push a lever down and a pellet drops out, or they get shocked, and so they adapt to their environment. And Skinner basically viewed man as an animal, concluding that humans made decisions much like animals did. And so their behavior, like you could train an animal with rewards and consequences, you could also train humans through rewards and consequences. So Skinner believed that man is just a product of his environment, and that the environment determines what he is and what he becomes, how he acts. So Skinner tried to modify behavior by these positive or negative reinforcements. So in short, when you think about Skinner, the key concept here is behavior modification. Freud was subconscious and conscious. Skinner's key idea is behavior modification. So using rewards or punishments to associate them in the thinking of humans so that they no longer do the negative behavior. This is the way to kind of modify or reprogram the choices that human makes. Another famous behaviorist was Orville Maurer. He was an American psychologist as well. He originally liked Freud's teaching, but then abandoned his affection for Freud's psychoanalysis because Maurer was struggling with depression, and he found Freud's theory no help to him at all. Sadly, Maurer continued to struggle with depression throughout his whole life and ended up committing suicide at age 75. But Maurer taught that man's problems come from improper behavior. Improper behavior is hurting someone else. Guilt comes when you don't live up to your standards, is what Maurer taught. Confession and restitution were needed, group therapy. Maurer believed that mental illness was biologically caused, organically caused, something in the body was causing it, that it was not a spiritual issue. So Maurer came to a tragic end, but he was also an influential behaviorist. So that's the second key phase of modern psychology. And what you're seeing in these things is that some of these men just had a little grain of truth surrounded by a bunch of error, which made it hard for Christians to distinguish the truth from the error. The third major phase of modern psychology is what we would call humanistic psychology, self-focused psychology, man-centered psychology, also known as third force psychology. This humanistic approach developed in the 1950s, and it fit perfectly with the rebellious hippie culture of the 1960s and the 1970s. Humanistic psychology, just like the second wave was a reaction to the first wave, humanistic psychology reacted to the second wave's teaching on determinism. They didn't like the behavior modification, and they didn't like Freud's determinism, that we are basically because of what happened in our past. The founder of humanistic psychology was Abraham Maslow, and he developed this hierarchy of human needs that you may have heard before. Starting at the bottom here, biological, safety, love and belonging, esteem, cognitive, aesthetic, and self-actualization. And so in Maslow's humanistic psychology, we all as human beings need to reach this level of self-actualization. And his theory was you can't move up to the next level and eventually reach self-actualization until the more basic needs have been met, until your biological needs have been met, until you know that you're safe. Well, his theory has been disproved by human history many times, but this is what Maslow taught. But the most influential humanistic psychologist, and perhaps the most influential psychologist of all time, was known as Carl Rogers. Rogers was an American psychologist, and he grew up in a religious home. Rogers' father was part of the Congregationalist denomination, and Rogers' mother allegedly was a devout Baptist. Rogers attended seminary, at the liberal Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Not a helpful school. And after his graduation, perhaps because of what he had been taught at this apostate seminary, Rogers himself became an apostate and became an atheist, and then later in his life became an agnostic. Rogers did not believe that absolute reality existed, that experience was the final authority for humans. Rogers is best known for his client-centered therapy, a very non-confrontational, non-directive approach where you focus on the counselee's feelings and attitudes. So if your psychologist is practicing Rogerian therapy, he's not going to confront you. He's just going to accept you and everything about you. The psychologist's goal in Rogerian therapy is not to solve problems for you, but to help you to grow. So Rogers wrote, the counselor accepts, recognizes, and clarifies these negative feelings. So essentially, in Rogerian therapy and psychology, the counselor or the therapist basically serves as a mirror to reflect the counselee back to himself so that the counselee can see himself clearly and figure things out for himself. You don't confront him, you just try and help them to figure it out. And so, no surprise, in Rogerian therapy, man is essentially good. So this is humanistic psychology. Rogers is perhaps the most influential psychologist of all time. It was very man-centered, self-centered psychology. And then the fourth phase of modern psychology is just simply that, modern psychological theories from the last few decades. There are too many theories, psychological theories, that have developed since the 1970s for us to cover them all, because there are around 450 psychological theories today, 450 approaches to psychological therapy, which should give us pause to think, boy, they haven't figured out what's going on here. But we should note two of the major modern players. First is called systemic therapy, and the second is called cognitive behavioral therapy. Systemic therapy is more popularly known as the 12-step approach, or what's been popularized by AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. It's also known as the recovery movement. It was popularized by an American named John Bradshaw. Bradshaw himself had been abandoned by an alcoholic father, but he found AA to be a help to him. And so Bradshaw, in this 12-step, popularized terminology that are still in use today, decades after he introduced them. Some of Bradshaw's 12-step concepts include the family as a system, the family of origin, which basically teaches that the majority of your problems stem from your family. He popularized the expression dysfunctional family, somebody who's an enabler or a codependent, subconscious roles, your inner child, shame. And shame. Shame was a huge concept in Bradshaw's theory. So Bradshaw proposed that to heal our inner child, we have to go through several different phases, and one of those phases is anger. You have to get angry. So basically in systemic therapy, 12-step, if it's taught as Bradshaw taught it, kids will invariably begin to blame their parents for their problems. And so basically, the AA philosophy is largely Freud repackaged. Now, not necessarily with the sexual component that Freud had in his theory, but this blaming your problems on your parents, your church, other things. So systemic therapy is a popular therapy. Another popular modern psychological theory is called cognitive therapy. Cognitive therapy, it's probably the most employed psychological therapy today. And the big name to associate here is a fellow named Albert Ellis, another American. He just died in 2007. But Ellis is one of the most significant psychotherapists in history. Probably the most influential was Carl Rogers, his humanistic, Second would be Albert Ellis with his cognitive therapy, and third would be Sigmund Freud. Those are probably the three most influential psychologists in history. And Ellis developed what is known as cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT for short. And like I mentioned, it's probably the most popular psychological therapy today. One of the strains of CBT is known as rational emotive behavior therapy, or REBT, which focuses on thinking, getting people to try and deal with irrational thoughts. And there is a level of some truth in this when they blame a lot of what people do in the interpretation of their circumstances, how they interpret life circumstances, dealing with these irrational thoughts. But they don't get down to the heart issue. Ellis was trained as a Freudian, but he discarded Freud's theory. And Ellis basically encourages patients to accept themselves just as they are. Does that sound like the 21st century or what? Ellis wrote that what works best for you may be radically different than what works best for other people. So it's not objective. But what I want to note about Ellis here, the second most influential psychologist in the history of modern psychology, is I want you to note that Ellis was also an atheist. He was a very immoral man, and he was divorced more than once. I think his first marriage was annulled and his second marriage ended in divorce. Also instructive about Ellis is that he was hyper infatuated with sex, just like Freud was. And so Ellis researched it and wrote several books on sex. He was sex saturated. He was an immoral man. This cognitive behavioral therapy, which is perhaps the most commonly practiced therapy today, was taken to the next level by a school founded by Dr. Aaron Beck. The Beck Institute is one of the leading proponents of cognitive behavioral therapy today. But they use an eclectic method, and by that I mean a lot of what psychologists do is they don't just stick to one person's method or philosophy. They'll pull in different things. They're eclectic, piecing together different ideas. So they say on their website, the Beck Institute, that proposes cognitive behavioral therapy, says we use a variety of cognitive, so thinking, and behavioral techniques, but it isn't defined by its use of these strategies. We do a lot of problem solving, and we borrow from many psychotherapies. And then they list some of these theories that they borrow from, because there are about 450 psychotherapies today, including dialectical behavior therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, Gestalt therapy, compassion-focused therapy, mindfulness, solution-focused therapy, motivational interviewing, positive psychology, interpersonal psychotherapy, and it goes on. So they're using an eclectic model of whatever seems to work for you. And this is a frustration with those that get secular psychological training. If they're honest with their training, I've encountered this before, or someone who was getting secular psychological training, advanced degree, and it was frustrated because it just seemed to be like a smorgasbord. You pick and choose whatever works for you. Where's the objective truth here? This mindfulness therapy is one that I believe is growing in popularity. When we were getting our physicals done in order to become permanent residents of Canada, I was talking to our doctor, who was the lady that was doing the physicals for us. She was a nice lady, very competent, very professional, a Jewish lady. And She was telling me that her husband practiced therapy, that he was a psychologist. And so I asked her, what type of therapy does he practice? And she said he practices mindfulness therapy, which oversimplified is basically doing unto others as you would have them to do unto you. And so you see this eclectic mix today, and people stumbling on some truth and then mixing it with error and humanistic self-centered philosophies. Beck, one of the key men in cognitive behavioral therapy that's so prevalent today, believed that negative thinking was the cause of mental illness and depression. So he did not take the biological approach that there's something wrong in our bodies that is causing the depression and mental illness. He believed that negative thinking was the cause of mental illness and depression. Not every psychologist accepts that today. So don't check out on me here. Don't say, well, I don't want to take this class if it's going to be history every week. It's not. Today was the big history day, and I did it very intentionally to expose you to some of these major players in modern psychology, to show you the need for biblical counseling, because as we critique these theories next time and get into the biblical view of man, start to get into the essence of biblical counseling, it'll be much more practical than tonight's lecture was. But I wanted to present these secular psychological theories to show you that the three most influential men in the history of modern psychology were all very depraved and disturbed men. So the first most influential, probably Carl Rogers. Remember, he was an apostate. He abandoned the faith. He was an atheist. Second most influential, Albert Ellis, cognitive therapy. He was an atheist as well, and he was infatuated with sex. And then the third most influential psychologist in modern history, Sigmund Freud. He was a godless pagan, and he was sex infatuated as well. Why do I share these things? Not to run these men down who are dead, but I want to, if you are looking to these secular psychologists' theories, and these are the three most influential in almost any discipline of psychology today that involves therapy and counseling, your psychologist, even if he claims to be a Christian, most of them are going to be using philosophies taught by Rogers, Ellis, or Freud. Maybe an eclectic mix of various therapies. These are the three most influential men, and they were depraved, disturbed men. So the question I want to leave you with tonight is, can you trust the conclusions of these three men about the human personality, the human mind, and the human soul? That's what psychology means, the study of the soul. Used to be reserved for Christians and the church. And now psychologists have said, no, get out of here. This is our arena. But before you go to a secular psychologist or even a Christian psychologist, because many of them are more secular than they are Christian in their approach, but before you go to them for mental issues, ask yourself, can we as Christians trust the conclusions that men like Rogers, Ellis, and Freud came to about the human mind and soul? That's a question that each of us has to answer. I'm grateful for your time tonight. Hope this was helpful and instructive for you. The future lectures will be more biblically focused and practically focused, but we wanted to lay the groundwork tonight. And so we've done that. We'll come back next time and critique secular psychologies and start looking at what biblical counseling is all about. So thanks for your time tonight.